It was the summer of 1940. France had fallen, and Britain stood alone against Hitler's powerful war machine. In the dark halls of Parliament, a voice echoed with strength and defiance. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender." These words were more than just a speech. They were a promise, a declaration of resilience in the face of destruction. The man who spoke them was Winston Churchill, a leader who understood that sometimes words are as powerful as weapons. In a time of darkness, he gave people hope, transforming fear into determination. His voice became the heart of Britain's resistance, and his name would forever be linked to one of the most crucial moments in history. But Churchill was not a man who simply rose to power when the world needed him. His journey was filled with failures, criticism, and political exile. He was a man who had been doubted, underestimated, and even ridiculed. Many believed his career was over long before he became prime minister. Yet, he never stopped believing in his destiny. His story is not just about war and leadership. It is about perseverance, courage, and the ability to rise after every fall. He was not born a hero. He became one through hardship, determination, and an unshakable vision for his country. His life is filled with valuable lessons, and by listening to his story, you are not only improving your English, but also learning about one of history's greatest figures. Every great leader has a beginning, and Churchill's journey started long before his famous speeches and wartime leadership. He was once a boy who struggled in school, a young man eager to prove himself on the battlefield, and a politician who faced both triumph and defeat. To understand Winston Churchill, we must go back to the very start of his life, a life that was destined for greatness. Before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Learning English through stories is a powerful way to expand your vocabulary and listening skills. Now, sit back, listen carefully, and let's dive into the extraordinary life of Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was born on November 30th, 1874, into one of Britain's most prominent families. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a rising star in British politics, while his mother, Jenny Jerome, was a wealthy and glamorous American socialite. From the very beginning, Winston's life was shaped by privilege, yet it was also marked by distance. His parents were often absent, too occupied with their social and political lives to give him much attention. Instead, young Winston was raised by nannies and sent off to boarding schools, where he quickly gained a reputation, not for brilliance, but for being difficult. He was not an exceptional student. In fact, he struggled academically, earning poor grades and often being reprimanded by his teachers. He was rebellious, restless, and uninterested in subjects that did not capture his imagination. Latin and mathematics were a constant struggle, but he showed an early love for history and the English language. His love for words would later define his legacy, but at the time, his academic failures were a source of frustration for his strict father. Lord Randolph saw his son as a disappointment, a boy who would never live up to the family name. At the age of 12, Churchill was sent to Harrow, a prestigious school, where he continued to underperform. However, there was one area where he excelled: public speaking. He joined the school's debate club and discovered a natural talent for persuasion and rhetoric. Despite his struggles in the classroom, he found confidence in his ability to express himself. But this newfound passion was not enough to change his father's opinion of him. Lord Randolph had already decided that Winston was unfit for a traditional career in politics or law, so he pushed him toward the military, believing it was the only path where he could find some discipline. Churchill applied to the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, but he failed the entrance exam, not once, but twice. It was an embarrassment for his family, but Winston did not give up. On his third attempt, he finally passed and was admitted. This was a turning point in his life. At Sandhurst, he found structure and purpose. The discipline of military life suited him, and for the first time, he felt a sense of accomplishment. He graduated in 1895 and joined the British Army as a cavalry officer, eager to prove himself not just as a soldier, but as a man worthy of recognition. The army took Churchill across the world. He served in India, the Sudan, and South Africa, witnessing firsthand the brutal realities of war. But while other officers focused solely on military strategy, Churchill had bigger ambitions. He saw war as an opportunity, not just to fight but to write. He became a war correspondent, sending back detailed reports from the battlefield, blending storytelling with sharp political analysis. His reports were not just informative, they were exciting, filled with drama and vivid descriptions of combat. His writings gained him attention in Britain, and soon he was publishing books about his experiences. Then came an event that would test his courage like never before. In 1899, Churchill was in South Africa covering the Boer War when he was captured by enemy forces. As a prisoner of war, he faced the humiliation of captivity, but he refused to accept defeat. After weeks of careful planning, he made a daring escape, traveling over 300 miles across enemy territory before reaching safety. His escape turned him into a national hero. Newspapers in Britain praised his bravery, and suddenly, the young officer who had once been dismissed as an academic failure was now a household name. Churchill knew how to use this moment to his advantage. He returned to Britain a decorated war hero and wasted no time in launching his political career. In 1900, he ran for Parliament as a Conservative candidate. He won, securing a seat in the House of Commons at just 25 years old. It was an incredible achievement for a man who had once been considered a failure. But Churchill was not content with simply being an MP. He wanted to shape history. And for that, he would have to navigate the treacherous world of politics, where friends could turn into enemies, and power was never permanent. His journey in Parliament was just beginning, but it would not be easy. Churchill was ambitious, outspoken, and unwilling to simply follow the party line. His ability to captivate audiences with his speeches made him a rising star, but his refusal to conform made him controversial. He had stepped into the political arena, ready for battle, but he had no idea that the greatest battles of his life were still ahead. Winston Churchill entered Parliament with the same confidence and ambition that had carried him through his military career. He was young, charismatic, and determined to make an impact. However, he quickly realized that the world of politics was even more ruthless than the battlefield. He was a conservative, but he did not always agree with his own party. His independent thinking made him stand out, but it also made him enemies. Churchill was not afraid to challenge traditional views, and within a few years he shocked everyone by switching sides, leaving the Conservative Party to join the Liberals. Many saw this as an act of betrayal, but Churchill believed he was simply following his principles. As a Liberal, Churchill gained influence and quickly climbed the political ladder. By 1908, he was appointed president of the Board of Trade, making him one of the youngest government ministers in British history. He pushed for social reforms, advocating for workers' rights and better living conditions for the poor. He was ambitious and energetic, but he was also controversial. His opponents saw him as reckless, an unpredictable politician who cared more about his own advancement than loyalty to any party. Despite the criticism, Churchill continued to rise. In 1910, he became Home Secretary, responsible for law and order in Britain. It was a powerful position, but one that came with difficult decisions. When violent protests erupted in London, Churchill did not hesitate to send in the police, and in some cases, even the military, to restore order. His actions were seen by some as necessary but by others as excessive. For the first time, the public began to question whether his bold leadership was an asset or a liability. Then, in 1911, he was given an even greater responsibility, First Lord of the Admiralty, the head of the British Navy. Churchill had always been fascinated by military strategy, and now he had the chance to shape Britain's naval power. He modernized the fleet, preparing the country for potential conflict. His reforms were forward-thinking, and when World War I broke out in 1914, Britain's navy was stronger than ever. But Churchill's biggest test was yet to come, and it would lead to one of the greatest failures of his career. Determined to break the stalemate of the war, Churchill devised a plan to attack the Ottoman Empire by launching a naval assault on the Dardanelles Strait. If successful, it would open a direct route to Russia and weaken Germany's ally. It was a bold strategy, but it was also risky. When the attack began in 1915, it quickly turned into a disaster. The Ottomans were well prepared, and the British forces suffered heavy losses. The failure of the Gallipoli campaign was devastating, and Churchill took much of the blame. He was forced to resign from his position, humiliated and disgraced. For a man as ambitious as Churchill, this was a crushing blow. He had gone from one of the most influential leaders in the government to being sidelined and ridiculed. Many believed his political career was over. But Churchill was not a man who accepted defeat easily. Instead of retreating from public life, he decided to return to the battlefield. He rejoined the army and served on the Western Front, proving that he was not just a politician, but a soldier willing to fight alongside his men. By the end of the war, Churchill slowly began to rebuild his reputation. He re-entered government, holding various positions in the 1920s. However, his career remained turbulent. In 1924, he made another shocking move. He returned to the Conservative Party, the very party he had once abandoned. Many conservatives did not trust him, but he was too talented to ignore. He was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer, responsible for Britain's finances. It was a prestigious role, but Churchill's decisions were controversial. He reintroduced the gold standard, a move that was meant to stabilize the economy but instead led to rising unemployment and economic hardship. By the early 1930s, Churchill found himself increasingly isolated. His ideas were seen as outdated, and his warnings about the rise of Nazi Germany were ignored. He was no longer in government, reduced to writing newspaper articles and giving speeches while others led the country. It seemed as though his best years were behind him, and many believed he would never return to power. But Churchill knew that history had a way of calling upon the right leader at the right time. His moment would come again, and when it did, he would be ready. By the late 1930s, the world was on the brink of disaster. Adolf Hitler had risen to power in Germany, and his aggressive expansion across Europe was alarming. While most British politicians hoped to avoid another war, Churchill saw the danger clearly. He repeatedly warned Parliament that appeasing Hitler would only lead to catastrophe. His speeches were passionate, filled with urgency, but few wanted to listen. Many saw him as a relic of the past, a man obsessed with war in a time when diplomacy was preferred. Yet, Churchill refused to stay silent. He knew that a great storm was coming, and Britain was not prepared. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and Britain had no choice but to declare war. Suddenly, Churchill's warnings no longer seemed exaggerated. They had become reality. He was brought back into government as First Lord of the Admiralty, the same position he had held during World War I. The Navy welcomed him back with a simple message: "Winston is back." But Churchill was not satisfied with just leading the Navy. He knew that Britain needed stronger leadership, and in May 1940, as Germany crushed France and pushed towards Britain, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain resigned. There was only one man who could unite the country in its moment of crisis. Churchill was chosen to lead. Becoming Prime Minister at this moment was like stepping onto a sinking ship. The British Army had suffered a devastating defeat in France, and over 300,000 soldiers were trapped at Dunkirk, surrounded by the German forces. Many in government believed that the only option was to negotiate with Hitler, to seek peace before Britain was completely overrun. But Churchill refused. He believed that surrender was never an option. In one of his first acts as Prime Minister, he launched Operation Dynamo, a desperate evacuation effort to rescue the stranded soldiers. Against all odds, British civilian boats crossed the English Channel, helping to bring the troops home. It was a miracle, but Churchill knew that it was just the beginning of the struggle. With France defeated and much of Europe under Nazi control, Britain stood alone. Hitler believed that the British people would lose hope, that they would beg for peace. But Churchill had other plans. He took to the radio, speaking directly to the nation, delivering some of the most powerful speeches in history. He told the British people that they would fight in the air, on the seas, and in the streets, that they would never surrender. His words became a weapon, strengthening the national spirit. For the first time since the war began, people began to believe that victory was still possible. But speeches alone could not win a war. Churchill had to make difficult decisions. In 1940, the German Air Force launched the Blitz, bombing London and other cities night after night. Thousands of civilians were killed, and entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Britain had no choice but to endure. Churchill walked through the rubble, speaking to survivors, showing them that he was not just a leader behind a desk, but a man who shared in their suffering. His presence gave people strength, and even as the bombs fell, Britain did not break. Then came another turning point. In 1941, Germany made a critical mistake by invading the Soviet Union. Churchill, despite his deep dislike of communism, saw an opportunity. He formed an alliance with Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, understanding that defeating Hitler was more important than political differences. That same year, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into the war. Churchill knew that with American support, Britain finally had the resources needed to turn the tide. As the war continued, Churchill worked tirelessly, traveling across the world to meet with leaders, strategizing every move. He coordinated with President Franklin Roosevelt and Stalin, ensuring that the Allies remained united. Every battle, every decision, carried the weight of millions of lives. Finally, after years of bloodshed, the moment Churchill had fought for arrived. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. Britain had won. The war in Europe was over, and Churchill stood before the crowds in London, acknowledging the victory with his famous sign for victory. For years, he had been the voice of defiance, the man who refused to bow to tyranny. But history is unpredictable, and the end of the war did not mean the end of his challenges. Britain had survived, but now it had to rebuild, and Churchill would soon learn that wartime leadership did not always translate into peace. Winston Churchill had led Britain through its darkest hour, and now he stood at the height of his power. The war had ended, and he was celebrated as a hero across the world. Crowds cheered his name, newspapers called him the savior of Britain, and world leaders admired his determination. But Churchill knew that winning the war was only the first step. Rebuilding Britain would be an even greater challenge. The country was exhausted, its cities were in ruins, and its economy was struggling. Soldiers were returning home to find their country forever changed. The people wanted more than just survival. They wanted a better future. Churchill believed that his leadership was still needed, that he was the man to guide Britain into a new era. However, the world had shifted. During the war, the British people had endured great sacrifices, and now they demanded change. They wanted jobs, better housing, and a stronger welfare system. Many believed that a new kind of government was necessary to rebuild the nation. In July 1945, just 2 months after victory in Europe, Britain held a general election. Churchill was confident that the people would reward him for his leadership. But when the results came in, the news was shocking. He had lost. The Labour Party, led by Clement Attlee, won by a landslide. For Churchill, it was a crushing defeat. He had dedicated himself to saving Britain, and now the very people he had led to victory had rejected him. Some of his closest supporters were in disbelief. How could a man who had stood against Hitler now be removed from power? But Churchill understood politics. He knew that the war had created new expectations. Britain was ready for change, and his time as Prime Minister had come to an end. He stepped down with dignity, though privately he was deeply hurt. He later joked, "They have a perfect right to kick me out. That is democracy." Though no longer in power, Churchill did not fade into the background. He remained a strong voice in global politics, warning the world about new dangers. In 1946, he traveled to the United States and delivered one of his most famous speeches in Fulton, Missouri. He spoke of a new threat, one that was rising in the East, the Soviet Union. He warned that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, dividing the democratic West from the communist East. This speech is often seen as the beginning of the Cold War, marking Churchill as one of the first leaders to recognize the growing rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Despite his loss in 1945, Churchill never gave up hope of returning to power. He continued to speak right and shape political debates. His writings on history and war were widely read, and he won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953 for his powerful accounts of World War II. His ability to turn history into gripping storytelling cemented his reputation not just as a leader, but as a man of great intellect and wit. Then, in 1951, at the age of 76, Churchill achieved what many thought was impossible. He returned as Prime Minister. Britain had grown disillusioned with the Labour government, and once again, the people turned to Churchill for leadership. But this time, things were different. He was older, his energy was not what it once was, and the world was facing new challenges. The Cold War dominated international affairs, and Britain's global influence was beginning to decline. Churchill worked to strengthen ties with the United States, believing that the Western world had to stand united against Soviet expansion. However, his health was deteriorating, and in 1955, after suffering a stroke, he finally resigned. His time as Prime Minister had come to an end, but his legacy was already secured. He had guided Britain through war, warned the world of future dangers, and shaped the course of history. Even in retirement, he remained a respected figure, his speeches and writings continuing to inspire generations. He had spent his life in the service of his country, and though he had faced defeats and failures, he had never allowed them to define him. His journey had been long and filled with struggle, but he had always believed that perseverance was the key to greatness. As he grew older, Churchill spent more time in his beloved country home, Chartwell, painting and reflecting on his life. He had lived through the most turbulent century in modern history, witnessing both the height of British power and its decline. He had been both loved and hated, celebrated and criticized, but above all, he had remained true to himself. The man who had once been dismissed as reckless and unpredictable had proven to be the leader Britain needed in its most desperate moment. His final years were marked by declining health, but his mind remained sharp. He continued to write, speak, and offer advice to world leaders. In 1963, he was honored by the United States with honorary citizenship, a rare tribute that reflected his influence on global history. But time eventually caught up with him, and on January 24, 1965, at the age of 90, Winston Churchill passed away. His funeral was one of the largest in British history. Leaders from around the world gathered to pay their respects. Thousands lined the streets of London as his coffin was carried through the city. As his body was laid to rest, the bells of Big Ben rang, marking the end of an era. But Churchill's legacy did not end with his death. His words, his leadership, and his unwavering belief in courage and determination continue to inspire. Churchill once said, "Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." His life was a testament to those words. He had faced obstacles that would have broken most men, yet he had always continued forward. His story is one of resilience, vision, and the power of words to shape history. Today, as we look back on his life, we see not just a leader but a reminder that, in the face of adversity, strength and perseverance can change the world. As Winston Churchill entered his final years, his place in history was already secured. He had led Britain through its darkest days, shaped the course of the 20th century, and left behind a legacy of resilience and determination. Yet, despite his accomplishments, Churchill was never a man to simply fade away. Even in retirement, he remained active in political discussions, continuing to meet with world leaders, offering advice, and writing extensively. His passion for history and politics never wavered, but his body began to fail him. Age and years of intense pressure had taken their toll, and his health steadily declined throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s. He spent much of his time at Chartwell, his country home, surrounded by books, family, and his beloved paintings. Painting had always been one of his greatest pleasures, a way to escape from the burdens of leadership. He had once said that if he had not been a politician, he would have been an artist. His paintings, though never his primary legacy, revealed a different side of him, a man who could find beauty even in times of turmoil. Though he largely withdrew from public life, his influence remained undeniable. His speeches and writings continued to be studied, and his warnings about global conflicts and power struggles were more relevant than ever. The Cold War had deepened, and Churchill's early predictions about the dangers of Soviet expansion had proven accurate. Many world leaders, including American presidents, continued to seek his wisdom, recognizing that his understanding of history and strategy was unparalleled. In 1963, he received one of the greatest honors of his life. The United States awarded him honorary citizenship, a rare recognition that demonstrated how deeply he had impacted the world beyond Britain. This was a man who had not only defended his own nation, but had helped shape the destiny of Western democracy. He had stood side by side with Franklin Roosevelt during World War II, had helped forge the alliance that defeated Nazi Germany, and had warned the world of the dangers that lay ahead. He had not just been a leader, he had been a visionary. But no man, no matter how great, can escape the passage of time. On January 15, 1965, Churchill suffered a severe stroke, one from which he would not recover. For days, the world waited, knowing that the end was near. On January 24, 1965, at the age of 90, Winston Churchill passed away. It was exactly 70 years to the day after his father's death, a poetic reminder that, despite all he had achieved, he was still the son of a man who had once doubted him. His funeral was one of the largest in British history. Dignitaries from across the world attended, paying tribute to the man who had shaped history. The streets of London were filled with people, some who had lived through the war and remembered his words of courage, others who had only read about his leadership but understood his importance. As his coffin was carried along the River Thames, dock workers lowered their cranes in a silent salute, a simple yet powerful gesture of respect. But Churchill's legacy did not end with his funeral. His influence continued to shape political thought, military strategy, and leadership principles for generations. His speeches are still quoted, his books still read, and his name still stands as a symbol of courage and determination. He had faced failure countless times, had been pushed aside, criticized, and doubted. Yet, in the moments when the world needed strength, he had risen, proving that true leadership is not about never falling, it is about always getting back up. His words continue to inspire. To each, there comes in their lifetime a special moment when they are figuratively tapped on the shoulder and offered the chance to do a very special thing, unique to them and their talents. What a tragedy if that moment finds them unprepared or unqualified for that which could have been their finest hour. Churchill was ready when his moment came. And because of that, history remembers him not just as a leader, but as a man who changed the world. If this story inspired you, let us know in the comments which moment of Churchill's life impacted you the most. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel to continue improving your English while learning about history's greatest figures. Your journey of learning and discovery is just beginning.